The British philosopher Bertrand Russell once told a story which is often called Russell's Chicken. And the essence of the story is this, is every morning the farmer would go out and feed his chicken. And every morning the chicken would go and just open its mouth and wait for the farmer to throw the food in his mouth. Well, morning after morning, the farmer threw the food in the chicken's mouth, expecting it. Then one day the farmer comes out, the chicken opens its mouth, and instead of the farmer feeding the chicken, he cuts the chicken's head off and cooks them. And this brings up an important point. It's the question of, what do we know? How do we know what we know? What reasons do we have for what we know? How much justification do we have for what we know? You might be surprised in the end to realize just how much faith we have to take even the most fundamental things of our life on. And that's what I want to look at this morning.
Getting enough variety in your diet? A healthy diet includes eating a wide range of foods: greens, yellows, reds, blues, nuts, vegetables, meats, fruits. Variety. It's important.
Most of us believe the sun is going to rise in the east tomorrow, but is there any absolute reason why it has to rise in the east? All we know is the fact that we're used to it rising in the east. There's nothing logical that says it has to. You know, maybe God will change the laws of nature and the sun doesn't rise in the east. So the point is, we have reasons to believe it, but they're not absolute. And then, you know, there's this thing called valid justification. And it talks about the fact that people sometimes have very good reasons for believing in things that are lies. Suppose you were a child raised in the home somewhere in the mountains of Pakistan, and from the time you were an infant, you were told about the glories of jihad. You were told, you know, you become a martyr and you blow yourself up and you'll go off to heaven and have 72 virgins, you know, with you. Though I think some Islamic scholars argue that the word isn't really virgins, it's raisins, but that's another issue. But the point is, you can have valid reasons for believing in things that really aren't true. So the question this leaves us then is, what can we believe in? What can we know that's absolutely certain? Well, you know, for many years, people believed that mathematics, 2 + 2 = 4, the angles of a triangle eat 180 degrees, a -3 multiplied by a -5 = 15. You know, these are kind of like absolute truths that nobody could question. Doesn't matter whether the mathematician, what he ate for breakfast that day or not, these truths are going to be true no matter what. Well, you know, that turns out not to be so true. It turns out that even in the 20th century, something considered as solid and foundational as mathematics has proven to be not so foundational as we once thought. And I think that's got some important implications for the idea of how certain we could be about anything we believe. You know, there's a story told about a mathematician who goes into a restaurant and he looks at his bill and he adds up the bill and he says, well, the math looks all right, but I'm afraid the axioms upon which the math is founded is not that solid. And you think, axioms not solid? Isn't that the whole point of axioms, to be solid? If you look up in a dictionary axioms are usually, these absolute things that are so certain that we accept them without proof. Now, accepting something without proof, what does that sound like a little bit? That sounds a little bit, like faith. Okay, you could expect that maybe with something like religion or something, but mathematics? I mean, come on, mathematics is supposed to be absolute firm, absolute solid, absolute fundamental. Well, folks, a funny thing happened in the 20th century, and it turns out that these things aren't absolute as we once thought they were. I mean, take for instance, geometry. How many of us all had, we've all been through geometry before. Remember geometry? They always tell you that the angles of a triangle equal 180 degrees. The shortest distance between any two points is a straight line. I mean, any clown, any bozo could see that. I mean, this is absolute solid stuff. Nobody questions this anymore, or nobody questioned it. I mean, it was from the time of Euclid. From the time of Euclid, this was known as absolute. Well, in the 19th century, it's very interesting. Some mathematician was putzing around with some stuff, and he came up with what's called non-Euclidean geometry. And in this geometry, it turned out you could have a triangle with angles that were more or less than 180 degrees. He came up with a geometry that the shortest distance between 2 points wasn't a straight line. It was a geodesic because, it was dealing with something curved. And the point is, all the way through these basic things about geometry, the foundation of it was cut off, was destroyed after all these years. Well, people thought, well, what the heck, what does it matter? It's just a bunch of speculation anyway, it's not reality and so forth. Anyway, well, Albert Einstein came along, and in the 20th century, formulated his general theory of relativity. And guess what, folks? That Euclidean geometry that you're taught, in reality, the shortest distance between 2 points is not a straight line. It's because space is curved. In other words, this foundational stuff of geometry, all the stuff that we taught that was absolutely firm, it turns out it's flat out wrong. In fact, I think they even question whether there's any such thing as pure Euclidean space. But the point is, something as solid, something supposedly as immovable as geometry, it got kicked out from underneath it as well. And then another thing happened too. There was a mathematician, his name was Gottlieb Frege. And Gottlieb Frege had an idea. He had the simple idea. He was going to put mathematics on a logical foundation. Okay, I mean, that makes sense. You think of anything, mathematics would be logical. I mean, come on, math, 2 + 2 = 4, and then, 3 + 1 = 4. And you think that if anything, if you think of the essence of logic, you think of mathematics. Well, this guy Frege spends his life trying to put together mathematics on a logical foundation. And he goes and he goes and he goes and he does all this work and he writes this brilliant expose, and he sends it out. Well, he sends it out to this well-known British mathematician named Bertrand Russell. And Russell is this young aristocrat and brilliant guy. And Russell reads Frege's essay, reads Frege's thing, and he says, I'm very impressed. You've done a very good job. He says, but there's just one question I have. And he asks the question, and he basically kicked out and destroyed the entire foundation of Frege's work. In other words, this man spent his life trying to put mathematics, we're talking now, we're not talking about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, we're not talking about that, we're talking math. He spent his life trying to put mathematics on a logical foundation, and Bertrand Russell came by and kicked the entire foundation of it out. And basically, the problem comes down to this. You ever hear the famous story about the barber of Seville? The barber of Seville shaves everybody in Seville who doesn't, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Seville, whatever. Seville, I'll pronounce it like an American, the barber of Seville, okay? He shaves everybody in Seville who doesn't shave himself. Does the barber of Seville shave himself? He shaves everybody who doesn't shave himself. Does he shave himself? Well, if he doesn't shave himself, then he has to shave himself. On the other hand, if he shaves himself, he doesn't shave himself. Now, this might seem like some silly little word game to you, but it gets to a paradox, a fundamental paradox about the limits of human knowledge and about the limits of human logic, and we'll come back to that again.